What's up, ladies and gentlemen? My name is Trevi. Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise, and just now, some new rules were just spoiled for Harlequins from the latest White Dwarf. I haven't actually read through these fully at all, or scripted anything about them, so I'm just going to run through these leaks, and we're going to talk about some of the new abilities that the Eldar Harlequin sub-faction has received. It looks like they're going to have some incredibly powerful characters, and potentially some insane stratagems that are going to totally transform how Harlequins play on the table. So let's get into it, and I'm going to give you my initial thoughts on these new leaks. So first up on the list, we have pivotal roles for each of the unique Harlequin character models. That is Troopmaster, Shadowseer, Solitaire, and Death Jester. Each of these pivotal role abilities replaces one of the standard abilities found in that particular unit data sheet. So, for example, the Troopmaster replaces its Choreographer of War ability with one of these three abilities. Like Warlord traits, these abilities are unique, so you can't throw them on multiple models. So I'm popping in here from the future a little bit. I do mention a couple times that you do have to select your pivotal role when you build your army, rather than before the game, like a lot of these abilities. That said, I did miss that Harlequins do have a new stratagem that allows them to give any character before the game a pivotal role ability in addition to their normal ability. This is actually pretty insane, since it will allow you to tech your characters for their particular matchups. For example, if you're fighting Centurions, you can give a Troopmaster with a Power Sword the ability to wound anything that's not a monster or vehicle on 2s, as well as keeping their 6-inch reroll aura, giving them wounding on 2s, reroll 1s with potentially -3 on their sword. Very solid offensive stat line. This is also very important for the Solitaire, who could potentially retain their Blitz and take Chromatic Rush for the 6-inch Pile and Consolidate or a Natural Acrobatics. You are still limited to one pivotal role on each of your characters, but because this is a pre-battle stratagem, you can use this multiple times and soup up all your characters with additional abilities and really tech them for the particular matchup. The Choreographer of War is the Troopmaster's 6-inch aura of reroll failed wound rolls, which is a pretty big deal. That's a very powerful ability and very good, especially for the standard Harlequin troops who have a high volume of attacks but are typically low to middling strength. But you can, if you want, you replace that with one of these. Prince of Light, which allows you to reroll charge rolls for units within 6 inches, or add 1 to the result instead if you can already reroll charges. Darkness Bite, which deals 2 mortal wounds to anything that you attack against at the end of your fight. And it is important to note that those 2 mortal wounds can target any unit as long as the Troopmaster attacked it. He doesn't have to have dealt any unsaved wounds, and it doesn't have to be a non-vehicle or something like that. He can hit a Titan or literally anything. And then lastly, Twilight's Grasp, which allows you to wound on 2s for anything that's not a monster or vehicle. I don't see that one as being particularly powerful. If you're fighting against specifically high toughness infantry, it might be okay. Things like Centurions or something like that. So you can use your highest AP power sword weapons and then wound on 2s automatically, so you can ensure that those hits go through. That's pretty good, although again, the Troopmaster is not so much of the melee monster that the Solitaire is, so I don't think that's particularly why you're taking him. You're normally going to take this guy to give that 6-inch reroll wounds. One thing I should note as well is that all of these pivotal role abilities take place at list construction rather than unlike most of these variable abilities that we're seeing pop into armies right now that happen before the battle. You do have to specify which pivotal roles you're taking when you build your list. So unfortunately, things like Twilight's Grasp is not going to be that useful, specifically because you don't know what you're going to be playing against. If you hit a bunch of Knights, you've basically just wasted your reroll wounds for this ability that's actually not going to matter. The Shadowseer abilities replace the Shield from Harm, which is a -1 to wound aura that the Shadowseer gives to friendly mask infantry. With Harlequin infantry especially being relatively easy to kill, the -1 to wound doesn't make a huge difference. Usually it just matters for high volume, mid-strength anti-infantry shooting like Stormbolters or something like that. The first one is Veil of Illusion, which reduces the range of weapons targeting models within 6 inches of the Shadowseer by 6, effectively meaning that your models can be 6 inches closer and be still slightly out of threat range. That does also matter for things like Rapid Fire, which will trigger at half distance, making it almost impossible to get a Rapid Fire shot off on models with this Veil of Illusion. This seems very matchup dependent, again, like these Troopmaster abilities, but could be very useful, especially if your opponent has a lot of mid to short range shooting. 18-inch to 24-inch range guns are going to be supremely hurt by this ability, especially since those are going to be the guns that are most dangerous to Harlequin infantry. I should mention that all of these Shadowseer abilities, unlike the shield from harm ability on his datasheet normally, affect all mask units, not just mask infantry units, which means that they're going to affect things like Sky Weavers and Star Weavers, which are going to be much more heavily affected by abilities like Gloomwake, which gives you cover if you're within 6 inches. For the most part, this feels like a pretty poorly thought out ability, since almost every Harlequin model has an invulnerable save that's greater than their armor save, so the benefit of cover doesn't really matter at all. That said, both Skyweavers and Starweavers have a 4+ base save, meaning if your opponent isn't sporting an AP value, they're going to be hitting up against a 3+ armor instead of a 4+ invulnerable. That's a little bit of extra resilience, but honestly doesn't really matter that much. A lot of armies in the game ignore cover, at least on some of their models, and I think this -6 inch to range is going to be a lot more effective in almost every situation. Last but not least, we have Agent of Bedlam, which subtracts 1 from the attacks characteristic of models in enemy units within 6 inches of the Shadowseer. A Shadowseer is mostly a support caster. They don't typically get into melee, and they don't hit particularly hard when they do. So I'm not sure that defending in melee is exactly what they want, especially since Harlequins want to be up in your face regardless. And for the most part, especially when combined with some abilities we'll talk about later, if the Harlequins are in melee, they're probably charging and hoping to wiping out the enemies that they contact. Next up, we have the Death Jester, who has to replace his Death is Not Enough ability, which is the ability that allows the Death Jester's controller to pick models that, as a result of leadership tests caused by its casualties. That means that you can make enemy unit leaders or heavy weapon bearers flee, or just pick ones that are better for you on a positional standpoint as well. As far as I understand, that's not really that much of a big deal. A lot of armies in the game sport high leadership values, or small enough generic units that picking the models that you pull out doesn't really matter that much, so I have a feeling that these abilities are probably going to be in pretty high demand for the Death Jester unit. The first one is Harvester of Torment, which triples the number of hits it receives if your unit contains 6 or more models. Units of 6 models are pretty prevalent, especially in the meta right now when you're seeing at least units of 10 Imperial Guardsmen, if not units of 30 Termagants or Orcs or something like that. Obviously, this might not be quite as effective against factions like Space Marines, who typically bring units of 5 models, so they won't be affected by this ability, but you do see big units of 6 Centurions or things like that, so sequencing your Death Jesters at the top of your shooting phase, meaning that they can score the most hits out of this, could be pretty insane. Using its standard Shuriken Cannon profile of Assault 3 and hitting on 2s normally means that this guy's going to be putting out potentially 9 hits every time it fires. Basically enough to wipe out or cause enough casualties to flee a unit of 10 standard guardsmen. This seems like an insane ability, but it doesn't really stack with many of the Death Jester's other abilities, like its ability to target characters with its gun, since it will never get that bonus against the character unit. That said, if you're just looking for a guy to clear out hordes of infantry, Death Jesters are already pretty cheap, and this guy being able to scythe through infantry at long range could be pretty useful. The next up we have the Just Inescapable, which adds 12 inches to the range characteristic of weapons, and gives it the sniper ability to inflict mortal wounds on rolls of 6s. In addition, this also allows this guy to ignore cover, which makes him a superlative sniper. He's going to have a 36-inch range Shuriken Cannon. That said, the Shuriken Cannon itself doesn't have the best profile for shooting at characters. Characters typically have a high wound volume, and it does only do 1 damage with no base AP. However, if you're bringing multiple Death Jesters, I don't really see a reason not to take this one. Makes this basically a no-brainer for the Death Jester. So far, these Death Jester abilities look insanely strong. Last one we have is Humbling Cruelty, which reduces the movement characteristic of models hit by 2 and, more importantly, stops them from firing Overwatch at your units. Well, the 2-inch movement penalty is probably a little bit more relevant than we think, considering that pure Harlequin armies typically have an extreme threat range and can dance around the center of the table. So relatively slow melee units with -2 inches probably have no chance of actually getting an alpha strike on. Ignoring Overwatch for your units as well is a huge deal. Obviously, Harlequins are fairly squishy, and especially with the power of Overwatch in factions like Space Marines, getting them into melee sometimes is a little tough without them getting killed by flamethrowers or hurricane bolters on Centurions, or something like that. Another benefit of this ability is that it only requires you to score a hit. You don't actually have to cause an unsaved wound or make a successful wound roll at all. You just have to hit that 2+ with 3 shots at it from the standard Shuriken profile, and you could ignore that Overwatch. This might end up being the most useful of the Death Jester abilities in this White Dwarf, simply because it's probably going to be useful in every single matchup you play it in. That said, if you're bringing 3 Death Jesters, it seems to me like you're going to want to have one of them swap out their Death is Not Enough for each of these abilities, since they're all so powerful. The Just Inescapable, probably not that much, since Death Jester's ability to actually kill characters is probably not that great. The extra 12 inches of range is pretty good, but because the Harlequins are a fairly aggressive army, Death Jesters can typically take the center of the table pretty well. That said, it'll be interesting to see which of these abilities ends up taking the front. I think they're all extremely strong. Unfortunately, the Solitaire's abilities are a little bit cut off in the leak that we got here, but I'm going to try to make the best of it. The biggest downside here is that they do require you to replace the model's Blitz ability, which is probably the most important ability on the Solitaire's card. They can get super duper fast as well as hit like an absolute truck the one time per game you get to activate it. First up, we have the Shocking Emergence, which allows you to deep strike the Solitaire and gives it a 3d6 charge, discarding 1 the turn that it comes in. This doesn't seem particularly useful since the Solitaires typically want to hide in the Harlequin lines and then bullet out as soon as contact's made and assassinate enemy characters. Not to mention the fact that the base move of Harlequins, especially Solitaires, is extremely high, and you'll very often be looking for much better than a 9-inch charge with the 3d6. Dropping 1 dice. I have to imagine this one might be a little matchup dependent, which is unfortunate since, again, you do have to pick these when you build your list. It doesn't seem useless, but it certainly doesn't seem as strong as Blitz to me. Next up, we have Chromatic Rush, which allows you to add 6 inches to your move every time you advance and gives you a 6-inch pile-in and consolidate. This does seem strong because it does actually almost take the place of Blitz. The 6-inch pile-in consolidate means that the Solitaire can make some pretty crazy in-melee moves, which might actually make this ability powerful enough to include outside of Blitz. You lose the extra 2 attacks from Blitz, but you do gain the ability to really dig into fights and make some insane moves up to 12 inches to get to the characters or the particular high-value targets that you really want to. One thing that I should note about all of these abilities is that, unlike Blitz, they don't preclude you from being targeted by Twilight pathways. So, Chromatic Rush, for example, could see you moving 18 inches, then, with the Twilight pathways from a Shadow Seer, move an additional 18 inches before your charge, giving you a pretty reasonable 48-inch threat range on this Solitaire. Way more than the standard Blitz threat range, but you do lose that additional damage output. Last up, we have Unnatural Acrobatics, which gives you -1 to be hit. These abilities are a little strange on characters since typically characters won't be in danger until the very late game, and at that point, especially models like the Solitaire that sit around with effectively a Storm Shield, they won't be in too much danger. I think characters most often get killed by things like Psychic Powers that don't even care about these penalties to hit. With Solitaires typically being cruise missiles that fire out of their army and deal a bunch of damage before dying, I don't know if you're ever really worried about your Solitaire surviving too long. This does make it, in some situations, a very difficult model to kill. Again, it does have that 3+ invulnerable save and -1 to hit on top of that. Could be tough with a reasonable stack of 5 wounds. But you are only toughness 3, so any hits that go through are going to wound pretty reliably. So I'm not sure that you're ever really looking for this effect. You kind of just want to bring Solitaires in as a model that can go deal a ton of damage in one go, and you don't want to be too worried about them surviving afterwards. So now getting into the Harlequin stratagem, I already mentioned this pivotal role stratagem, which is going to give you the ability to stack up your pivotal role abilities. Super important, I think, for new Harlequin builds, especially pure Harlequin builds who are going to be able to tech their characters for their particular matchups. And for only 1 CP, that's pretty reasonable, especially with some of the effects you can get by combining your pivotal role ability with the standard ability on... I can't stress this enough, though. Only the pivotal role stratagem allows you to retain the regular datasheet ability on your models. If you end up swapping into a pivotal role normally, you do have to replace the associated ability. Now that we've talked about pivotal role, the rest of these stratagems are frankly insane. If you're a Harlequins player, you're going to be super excited by what we're about to talk about, and anybody playing against Harlequins is going to have a bit of a tough time. First off, we have Polychromatic Storm. This is a little bit less exciting. It allows you to redeploy 3 units, effectively being like the standard Eldari Phantasm. It is a little interesting that Harlequins already have the 100 Swords of Vol, which is a 1 CP redeploy stratagem, but there are a couple key differences. Obviously, the discount is better here. You can effectively redeploy 3 Harlequins units for the price of 2, and Polychromatic Storm allows them to be set up with any special abilities or stratagems that change where they would be placed, whereas 100 Swords of Vault specifically allows you to place them back in their deployment zone. Next up, we have Murderous Entrance, which adds 1 to the damage characteristic of your melee weapons. This is a little pricey at 2 CP, but it does help out Harlequins a little bit, since they do have a lot of 1 or D3 damage weapons. Being able to add 1 to their damage is pretty solid. That gives them a pretty reasonable ability to kill tanks or heavy armor like that, and especially heavy infantry like Centurions or Aggressors that we're seeing pop back into the meta. Next up, we have the Curtain Falls and Twilight Encore. These are both fairly similar melee control stratagems and some of the most powerful stratagem abilities that I've seen in the game. The Curtain Falls for 2 CP allows you to replace your normal Consolidate move with a Fall Back move. This is This is insane. This is so crazy. If you don't know, abilities like this have created entire list archetypes around them. The Skyrunner Conclave list that we have shown on stream before is built entirely around the Windrider Host Detachment's Nimble Escape ability, which allows you to fall back after fighting in melee. And the Curtain Falls effectively does the exact same thing, except it doesn't require you to take a very specific set of units and a special stratagem to do it. You could just do it with any Harlequin's unit. This means that after a charge, especially with a particularly scary melee unit, if you end up not killing it, you can spend 2 CP and fall back out of melee and stop your opponent from being able to attack you. Because Harlequins have a pretty high base move, they can also use this as a hit and run ability, using centralized terrain to move back out of line of sight. For example, if they're able to destroy a unit, they can just run back into cover, and potentially, you're going to see this especially with units like Skyweavers, who have an insane base move of 16 inches, and are going to be able to bounce in and out of combat, jumping back behind ruins or giant L walls, or bouncing between objectives very quickly. Good Harlequin players are going to be able to use this Curtain Falls ability extremely well, and typically, only one use of this ability can often decide the game if it's at a pivotal point. I should also note that the ability to interrupt and then use this Curtain Falls immediately following your interrupt attack during your opponent's fight phase is sometimes game-ending. If your opponent is able to charge in multiple units, especially across the length of the battle, they'll only get to fight with one before you interrupt, then you immediately spend that 2 CP, leave melee, and you've probably left one of your opponent's most dangerous melee units out in the middle of nowhere ready to be charged again by Harlequin's unit next turn, and probably killed off. Next up, we have Twilight Encore. This allows you to follow up 6 inches into any unit that falls back from you. So you can imagine that most of the models in the game, especially things like Intercessors or Imperial Guardsmen, have a standard move of 6 inches, meaning that if you engage them in melee and they fall back, for 1 CP, you can effectively re-engage them. There's essentially no way that they're going to stop you from being able to move 6 inches again after them and re-engage them in melee. This allows you to keep your units safe, as well as stopping units, especially units with fly, from being able to fire after you follow up into them. I should note as well that this ability consolidates you, meaning that this move is able to move you within an inch of enemy units. You do have to move closer to the enemy unit that fell back, but you can choose instead to move towards the nearest enemy model, meaning that you could potentially spread your Harlequin's troop out and engage multiple enemies during their movement phase. If you engage a unit that hasn't yet activated in the movement phase, they can still elect to fall back, but that will probably stop them from shooting that turn. This is a frankly insane ability. I should note also that it is only usable on Harlequin troop units, so nothing like Skyweavers or characters. It's simply your troop's choice, basic Harlequin boys. This is, like the Curtain Falls, Twilight Encore is another ability that's going to be insane in the hands of a good player. And we're really going to see the upper ceiling of Harlequin's play be raised immensely. Currently, they play mostly as an aggressive force that can move up the table quickly, put out a little bit of shooting, and then play some melee shenanigans in the mid to late game. But with these abilities, they're really going to be able to lock your opponent down in melee for multiple turns, stop them from being able to do anything, and absolutely control their movement while keeping them safe from ranged attacks by just standing right next to where their opponent's guns are. With the ability to end closer to the nearest enemy model, this potentially allows a single Harlequin's troop to engage an entire enemy gun line all by themselves and rob your opponent from essentially an entire round of attacking. On the last page of stratagems here, we just have 4 additional abilities. 1 for 2 CP allows your Shadow Seer's Shield from Harm ability to infect any masked unit, not just your infantry. This means especially playing as the defender going second against a gun line, and especially if you've used the pivotal role stratagem to stack up multiple Shadow Seer buffs onto a single character, you're going to be able to give those guys potentially -6 inches of range or cover in addition to -1 to wound. And that will affect your units like Skyweavers and Starweavers, who have a little higher toughness value, where -1 to wound is going to be even more important. This seems like a pretty solid ability that you're going to use potentially first turn if you do end up going second and you are in danger of being hit by guns. Harlequin lists thrive on going first and being able to take table space and possibly get to melee on top of one. So having a little bit of defense on the flip side is never a bad thing. Next up, we have Mythic Roll, which is actually pretty interesting stratagem. For 1 CP before the game starts, if you have a Shadow Seer, you can select one Eldari unit to give essentially the Master Crafter's ability to reroll 1 hit or wound every time it attacks. It is a little bit different. It isn't 1 hit roll and 1 rune roll. It's only a hit or a wound, so you do have to keep track of it. But it does stack on top of the standard Master Crafter's custom craft world trait because it allows you to select any Eldari unit. So if you are playing in a souped list, this does impact anything. I'm not sure exactly what units you'd want to use this on, but I think there's going to be some situations where it is going to be pretty pivotal, especially hefty ranged attackers like Night Spinners or Fire Prisms, where you're pretty much guaranteed to be making those attacks every turn. Getting that ability to reroll one hit or wound is going to be pretty solid. I do like how this ability encourages you to soup in your Harlequins with other Eldari, because that is fairly fluffy and pretty core to the design of the Eldari super faction. Next up, we have the ability to deal D3 mortal wounds if your opponent kills a solitaire with an attack. For the most part, D3 mortal wound stratagems typically don't see a lot of, especially if your opponent kills the solitaire with a character or a unit that's pretty low on health, and you could potentially polish them off with that 1 CP strat, but typically we don't see these used very often. It is good to keep it in your bag of tools, though, because there are games where it is going to become relevant. Lastly, and this is another important one, we have Virtuosos of the Webway, which allows you, for 1 CP, to pick up a Harlequin's unit and deep strike it at the end of the next movement phase. We've seen abilities like this used to great effect, especially the Alpha Legion ability to do the same thing, and especially for Harlequins, which are a melee army, and even though they're pretty fast, they can be caught out of position a little bit if they are able to take out their particular targets on a flank. You can pick up that infantry unit and then deep strike them back where the fight is next turn so that they're never too far out of the action. That's all the stratagems covered, and I think this is the heart of some of the most powerful abilities in these new Harlequin rules. Some of these stratagems, especially the melee control stratagems, are absolutely off the chain insane. You're going to be caught out with them. You're probably going to be caught out by them in at least one of your first games against the new Harlequins, and you should keep them in the back of your mind anytime you play with or against Harlequins, because it has the ability to absolutely disrupt your game plan. Lastly, in these leaks, we do have a couple of new relics for these guys. The Shadowstone, which adds 3 to the range of your aura and psychic powers, especially seems pretty good, especially for a Shadowseer with one of the pivotal roles, since you can buff the range of that, and you can buff the range of all of their important psychic powers. Chegarak's Lament, which is effectively a special Shrieker Cannon for the Death Jester that gives them a base AP of -3. This is good, especially in conjunction with the new Death Jester pivotal roles, which are just going to make them generally more effective at any particular role that you want them to do, and adding a stack of AP on top of that is pretty solid. It also increases the damage of its whale shot to 3, which means that in some situations, especially when attacking multi-wound infantry, you might want to fire those whales a little bit more often into models like shurikens or intercessors that have multi-damage infantry, and you can very easily pop one out to deal D3 mortal wounds to the rest of the unit. With the Twilight Fang, which adds more and more attacks to the Troopmaster that's carrying it as the game goes on, this again combos pretty well with their other pivotal role abilities, since potentially you can ignore that +2 strength and make him wound on 2s, and then with a flat 2 damage -3 AP, that makes him very good at killing multi-wound infantry. By the time he gets really stuck into melee in round 4 or 5, he's going to be swinging in with 9 or 10 attacks, hitting on 2s, wounding on 2s, rerolling. Very solid damage output from that guy, and potentially has the ability to really clear out a lot of heavy infantry. Next up, we have the Veil of Tears, which allows you to automatically pass 1 saving throw per turn. This is the first time that you fail a saving throw, so you don't have to declare it before you take that save, meaning that it does make some of your models, especially things like solitaires, potentially pretty resilient. You can combo that with the -1 to hit pivotal roll, and actually make a solitaire potentially very difficult to kill. I should note, though, that this is once per turn, not once per phase, so if your opponent shoots you and you fail a save, you aren't going to be able to use that Veil of Tears ability until your next turn. It does also make you a little bit more resilient to Overwatch or attacks back on your turn, though, because it is turn, not round. So you can automatically pass 1 save during your turn when you charge in, and if your opponent's still in melee, for example, on the next turn, you can pass an additional saving throw. Unfortunately, Harlequin characters on the whole aren't particularly hard to kill, especially with that toughness of 3, so making them slightly more difficult may not be where you want to throw your valuable relic slots. Next up, we have Destiny's Jest, which is a little bit of an interesting relic that works a lot like a Chaos Knight Dreadblade Demonic Pact. It has a random chart of abilities that you can gain, and you can either select one or roll 2d6 and grab the two corresponding benefits that you roll. While multiple of these effects might stack on top of each other seem pretty strong, random relics like this don't typically see a ton of play, and selecting only one of them I think almost always will be strictly worse than just picking almost any other relic. Comparing this to something like Twilight's Fang, which gives you a bajillion extra attacks and extra strength, in addition to a flat 2 damage power sword, is pretty good. If you were to use this on a Troopmaster, you would be you'd find it pretty lacking since you can only potentially get +1 strength, +1 attack, or +1 AP. Last but not least, and I actually had to read through this relic a couple times to fully understand it, is the Domino Shroud, which frankly seems insane. Once per battle, at the end of any phase, if you didn't come in as reinforcements, you can choose to pick yourself up off the battlefield, then effectively bounce 12 to 13 inches away since you set up within 1 inch of the center of a marker you place 12 inches away. Now, I should note, this is at the end of any phase, so potentially you could use it in the movement phase to bounce 13 or 14 inches farther forward to get a sick charge off, or at the end of the fight phase, after you fought, you can use it to bounce safely out of melee. You could also potentially use it in the shooting phase after you shoot to jump back behind cover or something like that. Overall, seems very flexible and very cool. I really hope that it does see some play because it's one of the most interesting abilities that we've seen on a relic. And again, it's going to solidify Harlequins as a very high skill cap faction where abilities like this can be extremely powerful, but if misused, you can waste it since it is a once per game ability. So those are the latest Harlequin leaks from the latest White Dwarf. Thanks so much for watching the video, and I hope that you got some insight and some information about these new special rules. The Harlequins faction is going to be pure insanity. Harlequin detachments in mixed Eldari forces are already pretty strong, and this is just going to make them even stronger. We're going to see players that are good at maneuvering the assault phase and have a good grasp of these new rules absolutely dominate in some games, where they can run roughshod over their opponent, keeping them in melee, stopping their guns from shooting, and hit and running in and out of combat so that they can't be pinned down. Super excited to see these rules on the table, and the combos that come out of these new pivotal role abilities are also going to be very exciting to see. Again, thanks so much for watching the video. Remember to like and subscribe, do all that YouTube stuff. And remember to check out my Patreon, where there's a bunch of cool people getting early access to T5S2 tournament pods, early access to videos, and exclusive videos that come out monthly. So jump on over to patreon.com/tacticaltortoise to check that out and potentially join the group. And lastly, remember to keep it classy like this guy, and have happy wargaming.